I should have known that night would be different. The air in our Maple Creek house felt heavier than usual, thick with champagne bubbles and the kind of laughter that never included me. I sat in the corner of the living room, my hands still aching from hours of tying ribbon bows and arranging centerpieces for Chloe's wedding. Tomorrow would be her perfect day, the culmination of months of planning, thousands of dollars, and every ounce of my parents' attention. Through the archway, I could see them in the dining room. Dad, Richard, stood tall in his expensive suit even at midnight, raising his glass toward the chandelier. Mom, Eleanor, looked radiant in her silk robe, the kind that cost more than my entire wardrobe. And Chloe, my younger sister, glowed in that special way brides do the night before their wedding. They clinked their champagne flutes together, and the sound carried through the house like tiny bells, announcing a celebration I wasn't invited to. I told myself it was fine. I had grown accustomed to being the shadow in our family portrait, the one they cropped out before posting photos on social media. For 28 years, I had played this role with the dedication of a method actor. I was the responsible one, the helper, the one who asked for nothing and received exactly that. Chloe glanced over at me, and for a moment, I thought she might actually acknowledge the 12-hour day I had just put in for her wedding. Instead, she turned to Mom with a smirk I knew too well. I just hope she knows how to dress appropriately tomorrow. The last thing I need is her ruining the wedding photos. Eleanor's laugh was light, almost musical. Oh, honey, don't worry. I already picked out a gray dress for her. Very plain, very forgettable. She won't distract from you at all. The words should have stung, but I had built up such thick scar tissue over the years that they barely registered. I stood up quietly and headed toward my room, the smallest bedroom in our 6-bedroom house, the one that used to be a storage closet before they converted it when I turned 16. They didn't even notice me leave. I fell asleep around 1 in the morning, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been running on fumes of hope for far too long, hoping that somehow, someday, my family would see me as something more than a convenient servant. The sound of my bedroom door crashing open jolted me awake. My heart hammered against my ribs as I struggled to orient myself in the darkness. The bedside clock read 2:17 a.m. in angry red digits. "Get up!" My father's voice cut through the darkness, cold and precise as a scalpel. I fumbled for the lamp, and when the light flooded the room, I saw them both standing there. Dad held something in his hands, something that caught the light and sparkled. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. The crystal vase. The expensive one that had arrived that afternoon as a wedding gift from the mayor's family. "Dad, what's going on?" My voice came out scratchy, confused. Mom stepped forward, and I saw something in her eyes I had seen many times before but never this intensely. Pure hatred. Her face was flushed, whether from champagne or rage, I couldn't tell. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" Eleanor's voice rose to a shriek that seemed impossible to come from such an elegant woman. "We saw how you looked at Michael's mother during the rehearsal dinner. How you smiled at her, how you made her laugh with your little stories. You were practically begging for her attention." I blinked, trying to make sense of her words. Michael's mother, Patricia, had asked me about my work at the nonprofit. We had talked for maybe 10 minutes about urban gardening projects. It had been the only pleasant conversation I'd had all week. I was just being polite. She asked me about, "You were trying to steal attention from your sister." Richard's interruption was matter of fact, as if he were stating an obvious truth. "On the night before her wedding, after everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" The absurdity of the accusation should have made me laugh. Instead, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had seen my parents angry before, had weathered countless storms of their displeasure, but this was different. This was calculated. I wasn't trying to... I never finished the sentence. My father moved with surprising speed for a man in his 60s. The crystal vase swung through the air in a glittering arc. I tried to move, to protect myself, but I was tangled in blankets and confusion, and 28 years of trained compliance. The impact was stunning. Not just the physical pain that exploded across the left side of my face, but the psychological shock of it. The vase shattered against my cheekbone, and I felt the warmth of blood before I felt anything else. Pieces of crystal rained down on my bed, on my lap, each fragment catching the lamplight like accusations. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun, and through the haze of pain, I heard my father's voice, calm now, almost gentle. "Consider this an adjustment, Ava, a reminder of where you stand in this family. Your background noise, set dressing, and you will not, under any circumstances, take attention away from your sister tomorrow." I pressed my hand to my face, felt the sticky wetness there. When I pulled my hand away, it was covered in blood. Through blurred vision, I saw Mom kneel beside the bed. She leaned in close, and I could smell her perfume, the expensive French one she saved for special occasions. "Let's see who wants to take pictures with that face tomorrow," she whispered directly into my ear. They stepped back, and I watched through tears and shock as Dad pulled a champagne bottle from the hallway. It was already open, probably from their celebration downstairs. He poured 2 glasses with the care of a sommelier, handed one to Mom, and raised his own. "To tomorrow," he said, his eyes never leaving my crumpled form on the blood-stained sheets. "To a perfect wedding day, not a single flaw." Mom lifted her glass toward him, and they clinked them together. The sound was sharp and clear, a cheerful note that felt like another blow. They drank, standing over me, and then they left. The door clicked shut with a gentleness that was somehow worse than if they had slammed it. I sat there for a long time, unable to process what had just happened. Blood dripped onto my pajamas, onto the blankets, onto the shards of crystal that had been meant as a gift to celebrate love and new beginnings. My face throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the bathroom. The face that looked back at me from the mirror was almost unrecognizable. My left cheek was already swelling, turning purple and red in abstract patterns. There was a deep gash near my cheekbone, where the crystal had cut deepest. My eye was beginning to swell shut. I cleaned the wound as best I could, my hands shaking so badly that I kept dropping the cotton balls. Each touch sent fresh waves of pain through my skull. When I finally returned to my room, I gathered the crystal pieces carefully, wrapping them in a t-shirt and hiding them in the back of my closet. I didn't know why I was saving them. I just knew I couldn't throw them away. Sleep didn't come back. I lay in bed, watching the darkness fade to gray, then to the pale pink of dawn. Somewhere in the house, I could hear people moving around, the bustle of the wedding day beginning. I thought about staying in my room, about refusing to participate, but even after what they had done, the conditioning was too strong. Good daughters don't cause scenes. Good daughters do what they're told. At 7 in the morning, someone pounded on my door. Chloe's voice, bright with excitement and irritation, cut through the wood. "Ava, stop being dramatic and get out here. We need to start getting ready, and you need to fix your face. Don't you dare embarrass me by looking like some kind of victim." I opened the door slowly. Chloe stood there in her silk pajamas, her hair already in rollers, her face masked in some kind of green beauty treatment. When she saw me, her eyes widened, but only for a second. Then her expression shifted into something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Jesus, you really did a number on yourself." She stepped back, calling down the hallway. "Mom, you need to see this." Eleanor appeared within seconds, and her performance was Oscar-worthy. She gasped, covered her mouth with perfectly manicured hands, and rushed forward. "Oh my God, you poor thing. What happened?" Her voice dripped with false concern, loud enough to carry to anyone else in the house. I stared at her, and our eyes met. In that moment, we both knew we were playing a game. She was daring me to tell the truth, to cause the scene she knew I was too broken to cause. "I fell," I heard myself say. The lie tasted like blood in my mouth. "Last night, down the stairs. It was dark." "Oh, honey." Mom pulled me into a hug that felt like a threat. "You've always been so clumsy. We'll get you fixed up, don't worry. Can't have the bride's sister looking too terrible in the photos." She pressed something into my hand. A makeup compact, expensive concealer, the kind that cost more than I made in a week. "Do your best," she said, and there was nothing motherly in her tone. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Hairstylists and makeup artists flooded the house, transforming Chloe into a vision of bridal perfection. I sat in a corner, trying to cover the damage to my face with layers of concealer and powder. Nothing could hide the swelling, but I managed to make it look slightly less horrific. The Oak Ridge Country Club was everything a wealthy Virginia family could want for a wedding venue. Sprawling lawns stretched toward perfectly maintained gardens. A lake sparkled in the distance. White chairs were arranged in precise rows facing an arch covered in roses that probably cost more than my car. I stood in the bridal suite, watching as Chloe was laced into her dress. She looked beautiful, I had to admit. Like a princess from a fairy tale, all white lace and delicate beading. Mom fussed over her, tears of joy streaming down her face, and for just a moment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to have her look at me that way. "Ava," Chloe's voice snapped me back to reality. "Stop staring and go check on the flowers. Make yourself useful." I left the suite and wandered through the club. People were arriving, dressed in their finest, chattering about what a beautiful day it was. When they saw me, their conversations would stumble. I could see the questions in their eyes, the concern, but no one asked directly. In circles like ours, you didn't pry. You pretended not to notice. My Aunt Rebecca cornered me near the reception hall. "Sweetheart, what happened to your face?" Before I could answer, Mom appeared beside me, smooth as silk. "Poor thing had a nasty fall last night, down the stairs in the dark. You know how clumsy she's always been." Aunt Rebecca nodded, but her eyes lingered on my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe, or suspicion. The ceremony itself was perfect. Chloe glided down the aisle on Dad's arm, both of them beaming. Michael looked genuinely happy, which made something in my chest twist. He was a good guy, as far as I could tell. He had no idea what kind of family he was marrying into. I stood at the altar as the maid of honor, my face throbbing, trying to smile at appropriate moments. When the photographer directed us for family photos, I saw Mom whisper something to him. Suddenly, I was being positioned at the far edge of every shot, half in shadow, easy to crop out later. The reception was held in the club's grand ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and marble floors. I sat at the family table, picking at my salmon and trying to be invisible. It wasn't hard. No one talked to me anyway. Then came the speeches. Various people stood up to toast the happy couple, sharing stories and wishes for their future. When Dad stood up, the room quieted. Richard Williams was a respected man in Maple Creek, a successful real estate developer, a pillar of the community. Family, he began, his voice carrying easily across the room, is the foundation of everything we build in life. It's what keeps us steady when storms come. He paused, looking around the room, his gaze landing on me for just a moment. Sometimes there are cracks in that foundation, weak spots. But the wise builder knows how to cover those cracks with something beautiful, so no one sees the flaws underneath. The room laughed, thinking it was a charming metaphor. Only I understood the threat. Only I felt the weight of his words like another blow. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I danced when required, smiled when expected, and counted the minutes until I could escape. But escape to where? I still lived at home, trying to save money from my nonprofit job that barely paid above minimum wage. My parents had always discouraged me from moving out. Why would you need your own place? Mom would say. We have plenty of room here. Now I understood. They needed me close, needed me available for their use, their abuse, their entertainment. I was standing near the bar, sipping water and trying to ice my face discreetly with a cold glass, when my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I hadn't seen in years. Mark Chen. We had been friends in college, before my family had convinced me to drop out to help with Mom's charity work. Mark had gone on to become an investigative journalist, the kind who won awards for exposing corruption. The message was simple. Saw the family photos on Instagram. Are you okay? That doesn't look like you fell. I stared at the message for a long time. The fact that someone, anyone, had noticed, had questioned, had cared enough to reach out. Something cracked inside me, something that had been holding back a flood for 28 years. I typed back, "Can I call you tomorrow?" His response was immediate. "Anytime, I'm here." That night, after the reception ended and the guests had left and Chloe and Michael had driven off to their honeymoon suite, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. My face hurt, my body hurt. But more than that, my soul hurt in a way I had never allowed myself to acknowledge before. I thought about Mark's message, about the concern from someone who barely knew me anymore, and I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. This wasn't normal. This wasn't what families did. This wasn't love. Around 3 a.m, when I was sure everyone was asleep, I got up. I moved through the house like a ghost, guided by fury and clarity in equal measure. I knew this house intimately, knew where my father kept his laptop, knew the password because he had made me set up his email years ago and never bothered to change it. I sat in his home office, the one he kept locked but whose key I had copied months ago after he had locked me out when I needed to get a tax document. I opened his laptop and started searching. What I found made my blood run cold, then hot with rage. Emails about bribing city council members to approve his development projects. Voice recordings of him threatening inspectors who found violations in his buildings. Evidence that he had used substandard materials in a low-income housing project, cutting costs while families lived in potentially dangerous conditions. I grabbed a flash drive from his desk drawer and started copying everything. Files and files of evidence, years of corruption, all neatly organized because my father was nothing if not methodical. Then I moved to Mom's office, the one from which she ran her supposedly charitable foundation. Her laptop was easier to access, because she kept the password written on a sticky note in her drawer. I almost laughed at the irony. She trusted the people in her home while stealing from people who trusted her charity. The bank statements I found made me sick. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, donated by good-hearted people who thought they were helping children with cancer, elderly people without homes, families in need. Instead, the money had gone to designer handbags, luxury vacations, a second vacation home they kept secret. But the worst part was the emails. Mom had been using my photo in fundraising materials. Not just using it, but lying about it. She told donors I was sick, dying even, and needed expensive treatments. She had created an entire fictional narrative about my struggle with a rare disease, complete with falsified medical records. I had been her prop in more ways than I had ever imagined. I copied everything. Every bank statement, every email, every receipt. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. I already knew about Chloe's secret. I had known for months. She was having an affair with Michael's best man, a guy named Brandon who had stood up at the altar today and handed over the rings with a straight face. I had seen the text messages by accident one day when Chloe had left her phone on the kitchen counter. At the time, I had told myself it wasn't my business. Now, I realized I had been saving this information, storing it away like ammunition I didn't know I would need. I had screenshots. I had receipts from hotels where she had met Brandon. I had everything I needed. When dawn started to break, I had compiled 3 flash drives full of evidence. I sat at my father's desk, looking at them, and felt something I had never felt before. Power, control, the ability to choose what happened next. I called Mark as soon as it was a reasonable hour. His voice was thick with sleep when he answered. "Ava, are you okay?" "I need your help," I said. "And I need to know that I can trust you." "Always," he said, and I believed him. We met at a coffee shop in Richmond, far enough from Maple Creek that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I slid the flash drives across the table, and Mark looked at them like they were treasure. "What's on these?" "Evidence of fraud, bribery, embezzlement, and enough dirt to bury my entire family." My voice didn't shake. I felt calm, clearer than I had in years. "I want you to investigate it. I want you to write the story, and I want you to make sure it goes to everyone who needs to see it." Mark opened his laptop right there and started going through the files. His expression grew more serious with each document. After an hour, he looked up at me with something like awe. "Ava, this is massive. Your father could go to prison. Your mother, too. Do you understand what you're doing?" "Yes," I met his eyes. "I understand exactly what I'm doing." We spent the next 3 days planning. Mark brought in a colleague, a woman named Sarah who specialized in financial crimes. Together, we organized everything, built a case that was ironclad. "We'll need to coordinate," Sarah said. "Send everything to the right people at the right time. IRS for the tax fraud, FBI for the bribery, local news and national news simultaneously so they can't bury it. And this." She held up a manila envelope. "This goes to the Patterson family." The Patterson family, Michael's family, old money, political dynasty, the kind of people who valued reputation above almost everything else. They would not take kindly to their son's new wife being an adulterer. "Are you sure?" Mark asked me. "Once we do this, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure." And I was. For the first time in my life, I was completely, utterly sure. That night, I went back to the house in Maple Creek one last time. Everyone was out at some post-wedding brunch. I had declined to attend, claiming I was sick, which wasn't exactly a lie. I was sick, but not in the way they thought. I went to my parents' bedroom and looked around at the opulence. The king-sized bed with its silk sheets, the walk-in closets full of designer clothes, the artwork on the walls that cost more than most people made in a year. I took the pieces of the broken crystal vase from my closet and carefully arranged them on their bed. Then I took down the family portrait that hung above their dresser, the one where we all looked so perfect and happy. I laid it on the bed too, and with a single swift motion, I shattered the glass with a hammer I had brought from the garage. I left everything there, a message they would understand. Then I walked out of that house forever. I had packed a single suitcase with my essentials. Everything else could stay. I didn't want any of it, didn't want anything they had given me. I wanted to start fresh, completely fresh. I had chosen Portland, Oregon as my destination, as far from Virginia as I could get while staying in the continental United States, a city known for its progressive values, its emphasis on individuality, its acceptance of people who were different. Everything Maple Creek wasn't. The bus ride took 3 days. I watched America roll past my window and felt lighter with every mile. By the time we crossed into Oregon, I could barely remember why I had stayed so long in that toxic house with those toxic people. Mark kept me updated via text. The articles would publish in a week, giving him time to verify everything and give my family a chance to comment. They would decline, of course. People like them always declined. I found a small studio apartment in the Pearl District. It was tiny, barely 400 square feet, but it was mine. I paid the deposit with money I had been secretly saving for years, money I had never told my family about. I got a job at a bookstore cafe, one of those quirky Portland places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough. And for the first time in my life, every dollar I earned was my own. The first article hit on a Tuesday morning. I was making a latte for a customer when Mark texted me the link. Washington Post, front page of the Metro section. Brace yourself. The headline read, "Local Developers Empire, Built on Bribes and Substandard Housing." The article was thorough, devastating, backed by irrefutable evidence. By noon, other outlets had picked it up. By evening, the FBI had announced an investigation. I watched it all unfold from 3,000 miles away, my phone buzzing constantly with news alerts. Each notification felt like a small victory. Wednesday brought the story about Mom's charity fraud. Society Maven embezzled millions from cancer charity. The backlash was swift and brutal. Donors demanded their money back. Other charities issued statements distancing themselves. The nickname Saint Eleanor that my mother had cultivated for years became a cruel joke on social media. By Thursday, someone had leaked the information about Chloe's affair to the Patterson family. I didn't know if it was Mark or if they had discovered it independently, but the result was the same. The Pattersons issued a terse statement through their lawyer. The marriage between Michael Patterson and Chloe Williams is being annulled. The Patterson family has no further comment. I imagined Chloe's face when she heard the news. Part of me felt guilty, but mostly, I felt nothing. She had stood by while they abused me. She had participated. She had earned this. That Friday, I took my break at the bookstore and sat outside in the weak Oregon sunshine. The bruises on my face had faded to yellow and green, healing slowly. I had started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Morrison, who specialized in family trauma. She had told me I was incredibly brave. I wasn't sure about that yet. My phone rang. An unknown Virginia number. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message. It was Chloe. Her voice was ragged, broken. "Ava, please call me back. Everything is falling apart. Dad's been arrested. The FBI raided the house. Mom is being sued by everyone. And Michael's family won't even let me explain. They've destroyed me. We're losing everything." She paused, and I could hear her crying. "I know you did this. I don't know how, but I know it was you. Are you happy now? Does this make you feel better?" I deleted the message without saving it. More calls came over the next few weeks. My father's lawyer, trying to figure out who had leaked the documents. My mother, alternating between threats and pleas. Relatives I barely knew, wanting to understand what had happened to the perfect Williams family. I blocked every number, changed my phone, made sure there was no way for them to find me. 2 months later, I was shelving books in the literature section when a customer came up to ask for help. She was tall, with kind eyes, and when she smiled at me, I felt my heart do something strange. "I'm looking for something uplifting," she said. "I've been going through a hard time and I need stories about people who survive." I showed her to the section on memoirs and recovery. We talked for a while about books, about resilience, about the journey from victim to survivor. Her name was Lisa, and she worked as a social worker, helping families in crisis. "You seem like you really understand this stuff," she said as she paid for her books. "Personal experience," I replied. She smiled. "Well, if you ever want to talk about it over coffee, I'd love to listen." She handed me her number, written on a bookmark. I looked at the number for a long time after she left. It had been so long since someone had offered me genuine kindness, without wanting something in return. I texted her that evening. The news from Virginia continued to trickle in. Dad had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Mom was facing multiple civil suits and potential criminal charges. They had to sell the Maple Creek house to pay legal fees and settlements. Chloe was working as a sales clerk at a department store, her dreams of being a society wife shattered. I read each update with a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I had destroyed them, yes. But mostly, I had simply exposed them. I had held up a mirror and forced the world to see what they really were. One evening in late November, I was closing up the bookstore when I noticed an email in my inbox. The sender's name made my breath catch. Chloe. Subject line, "You win." I debated deleting it without reading, but curiosity won out. The email was short. "You win, Ava. You destroyed everything. Mom and Dad lost the house. Dad's in prison. Mom's in therapy because she can't handle the shame. My marriage is annulled, my reputation is ruined, and I'm living in a studio apartment working retail. I hope you're happy. I hope this was worth it. I hope you can sleep at night knowing you tore our family apart. Was your revenge really worth all this?" I read it 3 times. Then I walked to the big window at the front of the store and looked out at the Portland street. Rain was falling, the gentle kind that felt like a blessing. People walked by with umbrellas and dogs and coffee cups, living their ordinary, beautiful lives. I thought about what Chloe had written, about whether it was worth it. Then I looked at my reflection in the window. The bruises were gone now. My face had healed, leaving only the faintest scar near my cheekbone. But more than that, something inside me had healed. I stood differently now, carried myself with a confidence I had never had before. I hadn't torn our family apart. Our family had never been whole to begin with. I had simply stopped pretending that the cracks weren't there. I had stopped being the concrete they used to fill their foundation, sacrificing myself so they could stand tall. I didn't respond to Chloe's email. There was nothing to say that she would understand. Instead, I grabbed my coat and walked out into the rain. I was meeting Lisa for dinner, our 5th date. She knew my story, all of it, and she had listened without judgment. She had shared her own story too, about leaving an abusive relationship, about rebuilding her life from nothing. We understood each other in a way that people who haven't survived trauma never quite can. As I walked through the Portland streets, rain soaking my hair, I felt something I had never expected to feel. Peace. Real, genuine peace. Not the fake harmony I had tried to maintain in Maple Creek by making myself smaller and smaller, but the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're supposed to be. I hadn't just gotten revenge on my family, I had gotten my life back. I had claimed the space I was always meant to occupy. And that victory, the victory of becoming myself, was worth more than any amount of satisfaction I got from their downfall. 3 years later, I was the manager of the bookstore cafe. Lisa and I had moved in together, adopting 2 rescue cats who spent their days sleeping on the sunny windowsills of our apartment. I had finished my degree online, studying social work, wanting to help other people escape the kind of situations I had survived. I rarely thought about my family anymore. When I did, it was with the detachment of someone looking at characters in a book I had read long ago. They felt distant, unreal, like they had happened to someone else. Sometimes people at work would ask about my family, and I would say simply, "We're estranged." Most people didn't push. In Portland, that was understood. Chosen family was just as valid as blood family, maybe more so. One day, a young woman came into the cafe. She was nervous, fidgeting with her phone, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone would recognize her. She sat in the corner with a coffee she barely touched. I recognized the signs. I had been her once. During my break, I sat down at her table. "I don't mean to intrude," I said gently, "but if you need someone to talk to, I'm a pretty good listener." She looked at me with eyes that were trying so hard to hold back tears. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there." She started talking, and her story spilled out. An abusive family, a golden child sibling, years of being made to feel worthless. She was planning to leave, but she was scared. Terrified, actually. I listened, and when she was done, I told her my story. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Enough to show her that leaving was possible, that life after was possible. I gave her the number for Dr. Morrison and a list of resources. I told her about the bookstore, that we were always hiring if she needed a job. I let her know that scared was okay, that scared meant she was doing something brave. When she left, she hugged me. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." I watched her walk out into the Portland afternoon, and I thought about how far I had come. From the girl who had been beaten the night before her sister's wedding, to the woman who could now help someone else find their way out. That evening, Lisa and I sat on our tiny balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She was reading, I was writing in my journal, and our cats were purring at our feet. "What are you thinking about?" Lisa asked, noticing my distant expression. I thought about how to answer. About Chloe's email from years ago asking if I was happy, about whether my revenge had been worth it. "I'm thinking," I said finally, "that I didn't destroy my family. I freed myself from people who were destroying me. And that's not revenge, that's survival." Lisa reached over and took my hand. "And now?" "Now," I said, squeezing her hand back, "I'm just living, really living, for the first time in my life." We sat there as the sun disappeared behind the Portland skyline, and I felt grateful, not for what had happened to me, but for who I had become despite it. The scars on my face had faded, but they had taught me something important. I was stronger than anything they could do to me. I was more resilient than the lies they had told about me. I was worthy of love, of peace, of a life that was entirely my own. The girl who had stayed silent for 28 years was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who set boundaries, who chose her own family and her own path. A woman who had learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't about watching your enemies fall. It's about rising so high that you can't even see them anymore. As the stars started to appear in the darkening sky, I made myself a promise. I would never again make myself small for someone else's comfort. I would never again sacrifice my truth for someone else's convenience. I would never again light myself on fire to keep others warm. I had spent too many years being the daughter they wanted, the sister they could use, the scapegoat for all their failures. I had paid my dues in blood and tears and silent screams into pillows. Now it was time to be exactly who I was always meant to be, and that person was free. 5 years after that night before Chloe's wedding, I received an unexpected package at the bookstore. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Virginia. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it during my lunch break, Lisa sitting beside me for support. Inside was a single photograph. The family portrait from my parents' bedroom, the one I had shattered. Someone had carefully reassembled it, gluing the pieces of glass back together. The cracks were still visible, spider webbing across our smiling faces, making the image of perfection forever fractured. Tucked behind the photo was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery. I recognized my mother's elegant cursive immediately. The letter began without any greeting, diving straight into Eleanor's thoughts as if we had been in the middle of a conversation. She wrote about how the house in Maple Creek had sold for far less than it was worth, how the buyers had been bargain hunters who knew about the scandal. She wrote about visiting Richard in prison, about how he had aged 20 years in 5, about how the other inmates knew who he was and what he had done. She wrote about Chloe, working 2 jobs now, living in a studio apartment in Richmond with a roommate she barely knew. About how Chloe had gained weight from stress and cheap food, how her Instagram feed that used to showcase designer outfits and brunch spots now sat dormant and abandoned. Eleanor's tone throughout was not apologetic. It was factual, almost clinical, as if she were reporting on strangers rather than her own family's dissolution. But then, in the final paragraph, something shifted. "You were always the strong one, Ava," she wrote. "We told ourselves you were weak because that made it easier to use you. But weakness doesn't survive what you survived. Weakness doesn't plan what you planned. Weakness doesn't walk away and build something real from nothing. You were the strongest person in that house, and we punished you for it because your strength highlighted our emptiness. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I finally see what we did. I finally see what we were. And I am sorry that it took losing everything for me to understand what we had lost the moment we decided you weren't worth loving." The letter ended there. No signature, no closing sentiment. Just those words hanging in the air like smoke. I sat with the letter for a long time, Lisa's hand warm on my shoulder. I waited for the anger to come, the old familiar rage that had fueled my escape, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt something more complicated, something that included sadness and pity alongside the pain. "What are you going to do?" Lisa asked gently. I looked at the reassembled portrait with its visible cracks. It struck me as a perfect metaphor. My mother had put the pieces back together, but the damage was permanent. The illusion of perfection was shattered beyond repair, and maybe that was the point. Maybe she was trying to show me that she finally understood what they had broken. "I'm not going to respond," I said finally. "But I'm not going to throw this away either." I took the portrait home and hung it in my small home office, the room where I did my social work studies and wrote in my journal. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of where I came from and how far I had traveled. The cracks in the glass didn't make me sad anymore. They made me proud. I had broken free from that frame, from that false image, from that toxic definition of family. That same year, I graduated with my master's in social work. The ceremony was small, held in a community center in Portland, nothing like the grand graduations at big universities. But when they called my name and I walked across that stage, the applause I heard from Lisa and our small circle of friends meant more than any accolades I might have received in my old life. I started working at a nonprofit organization that helped people escape abusive family situations. My job was to provide counseling and connect clients with resources, help them navigate the complicated process of leaving and rebuilding. Every person I helped felt like another version of myself being saved. One of my first clients was a young man named David. He was 25, soft-spoken, with nervous hands that never stopped moving. His parents were wealthy philanthropists in Seattle, well-respected and admired. Behind closed doors, they treated David like a failure because he was gay, because he wanted to be an artist instead of a lawyer, because he refused to pretend to be someone he wasn't. David's story wasn't exactly like mine, but the emotional architecture was the same. The scapegoating, the manipulation, the way love was offered and withdrawn like a weapon. The belief that if he just tried harder, changed more, sacrificed more, they would finally accept him. "When did you know you had to leave?" he asked me during one of our sessions. I thought about the crystal vase, about the sound of champagne glasses clinking over my broken body. When I realized that the person they wanted me to be didn't exist, I said, and the person I actually was would never be enough for them. That gap between their expectation and my reality was killing me slowly. Leaving wasn't about revenge, it was about survival. David left his family 3 months later. It wasn't easy. He struggled with guilt and grief and the profound loneliness that comes from being orphaned by choice. But slowly, gradually, I watched him bloom into himself. He got a studio apartment, started painting again, began dating someone who actually loved him for who he was. A year after he left, he came into my office with a painting. It was abstract, full of dark colors that gradually shifted into bright, vibrant hues. "This is called After," he said. "It's for you. Because you showed me that there could be an after." The painting now hung in my living room, and every time I looked at it, I thought about all the people who were still in there before, still enduring, still hoping, still believing that if they just loved hard enough, their abusers would change. I wished I could reach all of them, tell them what I had learned. You cannot love someone into treating you well. You cannot sacrifice yourself into being valued, and sometimes the most radical act of love is to love yourself enough to leave. 6 years after leaving Maple Creek, I was invited to speak at a conference on family estrangement. The organizers had heard about my work and wanted me to share my perspective as both a survivor and a professional. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my strength, and the thought of sharing my story with hundreds of strangers terrified me. But Lisa encouraged me, and I realized that my silence had protected my family for too long. It was time to use my voice. The conference was in San Francisco, held in a large hotel ballroom. I stood backstage, my prepared notes trembling in my hands, listening to the speaker before me wrap up their presentation. Then it was my turn. I walked onto that stage, looked out at the sea of faces, and saw my own pain reflected back at me. These were people who understood. People who had made impossible choices. People who were still trying to figure out if they had done the right thing. I began to speak, and my voice grew stronger with each word. I told them about the night before Chloe's wedding, about the crystal vase and the champagne toast. I told them about the years of conditioning that had made me believe I deserved the treatment I received. I told them about the moment I decided to leave and about the life I had built in the aftermath. People will tell you that family is everything, I said, gripping the podium. They'll say blood is thicker than water. They'll insist that you owe your parents loyalty simply because they gave you life. But I'm here to tell you that you don't owe anyone access to abuse you. You don't owe anyone the right to diminish you. And choosing yourself, choosing your safety and sanity and peace, is not selfish, it's survival. The applause when I finished was thunderous. Afterward, person after person came up to me, some with tears streaming down their faces, telling me their stories. A woman whose parents had stolen her identity and ruined her credit. A man whose siblings blamed him for their mother's alcoholism. A young person whose family had disowned them for being transgender. Each story was different, but the core wound was the same. They had all been made to believe they were the problem, that if they just tried harder or loved better or changed more fundamentally, their families would finally treat them with basic human dignity. I listened to each person, gave them resources, reminded them that their pain was valid and their choices were their own. By the end of the conference, I was exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. That night, alone in my hotel room, I called Lisa. I think I found my calling, I told her. I think this is what I'm supposed to do with everything that happened to me. Tell your story? She asked. Help people tell theirs, I corrected, and remind them that they deserve better. I started writing a book after that conference. It wasn't a memoir, exactly, though it drew heavily from my experiences. It was more of a guide for people considering estrangement from toxic family members, combining practical advice with emotional support and validation. Writing it was harder than I expected. I had to relive moments I had tried to bury, had to examine the years of abuse with a clinical eye while not minimizing the emotional impact. There were nights when I would write for hours, tears streaming down my face, Lisa holding me when the memories became too heavy. But there were also moments of profound healing. Naming what had been done to me, categorizing the manipulation tactics, explaining the psychological impact gave me a framework to understand my own experience. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overly sensitive. I was a normal person who had responded normally to abnormal circumstances. The book took 2 years to write. During that time, I continued my work at the nonprofit, continued to help clients navigate their own escapes and rebuilds. Each person's story informed my writing, showed me new angles and perspectives I hadn't considered. When the book was finally finished, I wasn't sure anyone would want to publish it. Estrangement was still a taboo topic, something people whispered about but rarely discussed openly. But my agent found a small independent publisher who believed in the project, and Choosing Yourself: A Guide to Family Estrangement and Healing was released on a quiet Tuesday in April. I didn't expect much, maybe a few hundred copies sold to people in similar situations, maybe some reviews on niche websites. I certainly didn't expect what actually happened. The book found its audience, and that audience was larger than anyone had anticipated. It sold thousands of copies in the first month. People started sharing it on social media, recommending it in online support groups, buying copies for their therapists and friends. Within 6 months, it had sold over 50,000 copies and been picked up by a major publisher for wider distribution. I started receiving emails, hundreds of them, from readers sharing their stories. They told me the book had given them permission to leave, or validation for having already left, or the courage to set boundaries even if they weren't ready to walk away completely. They told me they had felt alone until they read my words and realized there was an entire community of people who understood. One email stood out among all the others. It was from someone named Jennifer Patterson, and the last name made my stomach clench before I even opened it. "Dear Ava," the email began. "I don't know if you remember me. We met once, briefly, at my son Michael's wedding rehearsal dinner. You were kind and interesting, and I enjoyed our conversation about urban gardening. I didn't know then what was happening in your life, didn't understand why you looked so sad even while you smiled. I found your book at my local bookstore and bought it on a whim. As I read it, I began to recognize details, to realize who you were, and I wanted to reach out to say that I am so profoundly sorry. Sorry that I didn't see what was happening that night. Sorry that I didn't ask better questions when I saw your face at the wedding. Sorry that my family's actions toward your sister caused you more pain, even though I know she hurt you deeply. You showed me kindness when you had every reason to be bitter and withdrawn, and I have never forgotten that. I hope you have found peace. From your book, it seems like you have. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for helping others survive. Sincerely, Patricia Patterson." I read the email 3 times, each time feeling something different. First surprise, then a wash of old grief for the girl I had been at that rehearsal dinner, trying so hard to be pleasant and normal. Finally, gratitude that someone had seen me, even if they hadn't understood everything they were seeing. I wrote back, keeping it brief but warm. I thanked her for the kind words and let her know that I harbored no ill will toward the Patterson family. What had happened to Chloe was a consequence of Chloe's own choices, not collateral damage from my revenge. Patricia wrote back immediately, and over the following months, we developed an unexpected correspondence. She was getting divorced from Michael's father, she told me, after 30 years of marriage. She had spent too long in a relationship where she felt diminished and controlled. My book had helped her recognize patterns she had been ignoring. "You helped save my son from a terrible marriage," she wrote in one email, "and you helped save me too, though in a different way. Thank you, Ava. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." 7 years after leaving Maple Creek, Lisa and I got married. It was a small ceremony in a botanical garden in Portland, surrounded by friends we had chosen, by people who loved us for exactly who we were. Dr. Morrison was there. David brought his boyfriend. My coworkers from the nonprofit filled 2 whole rows. There were no family members from my blood relations. But as I looked around at the gathered crowd, I realized I had more family than I had ever had growing up. Family wasn't about shared DNA. It was about shared values, mutual respect, genuine love. During the reception, Mark gave a toast. He had become one of my closest friends over the years, the friendship that had started with a concerned text message deepening into something rare and precious. "I've known Ava for over a decade now," he said, raising his glass. "And I have watched her transform from someone who was barely surviving into someone who is truly thriving. She took the worst things that ever happened to her and turned them into a mission to help others. She took the cruelty she experienced and responded with compassion. She is one of the bravest people I have ever known, and I am honored to call her my friend." Later that night, as Lisa and I slow danced under string lights, she whispered in my ear, "Are you happy?" It was the same question Chloe had asked in her email years ago, but the tone was completely different. Chloe had asked it with bitterness, as if happiness was something I had stolen from her. Lisa asked it with genuine curiosity and love, wanting to know the state of my heart. "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy, really, truly happy, for the first time in my life." 8 years after leaving, I received one final piece of communication from my old life. It came in the form of a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Ava?" The voice was hesitant, older than I remembered, but unmistakably Chloe's. My first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity kept me on the line. "What do you want?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her breathing. "I don't want anything," she said finally. "I just needed to say something, and then I promise I'll never contact you again." "Okay." Another pause. Then, in a rush, "I'm in therapy, have been for 2 years now. My therapist suggested I make amends to people I've hurt, not for my sake but for theirs, to give them closure if they need it. So I'm calling to say that I'm sorry. Not sorry that you exposed us, because you were right to do that. Sorry for everything that came before. Sorry for participating in your abuse. Sorry for enjoying it sometimes. Sorry for never standing up for you even when I knew what was happening was wrong. Sorry for being so consumed with my own importance that I couldn't see your humanity." I sat down slowly, my legs suddenly weak. Of all the things I had expected in my life, a genuine apology from Chloe had never made the list. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. It took me losing everything, working a minimum wage job, living in poverty, experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness you felt your entire life. And even that wasn't enough to really understand. I had to do the work in therapy, had to look at who I was and what I did without any of the justifications I had built up. And Ava? I was a monster. We all were. Tears were streaming down my face, though I wasn't sure why. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to hear it," Chloe said simply. "You deserve to hear someone from that family acknowledge what we did to you. Not to make myself feel better, not to ease my conscience, but because it's the truth, and you deserve to have the truth spoken out loud." We sat in silence for a moment, 3,000 miles apart, connected by a phone line and a shared history of pain. "I hope you have a good life, Ava," Chloe said softly. "I hope you found peace, and I hope you never think about us again." She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended, processing what had just happened. An apology from Chloe. Genuine accountability. An acknowledgement that the abuse had been real, that I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or any of the things they had accused me of being. Part of me wanted to be angry that it had taken so long, that she hadn't stood up for me when it mattered, that she had participated in my torment for so many years. But a larger part of me felt something unexpected. Relief. Validation. The confirmation that I had been right to leave, right to protect myself, right to refuse to accept their treatment as normal or deserved. I told Lisa about the call that evening, and she listened quietly, holding my hand. "Does it change anything?" she asked when I finished. I thought about the question carefully. I said finally. But it closes something. A chapter I didn't realize was still open. She gave me something I didn't know I needed. Permission to stop questioning myself, to stop wondering if maybe I had overreacted or been too harsh. She confirmed everything I already knew, but hearing it from her makes it real in a different way. Are you going to respond? No. She said what she needed to say, and that's enough. I don't owe her anything else, not even acknowledgement, but I'm glad she called. I'm glad she did the work to get to that place, not for my sake, but for hers, and for anyone else she might have hurt along the way. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. It was as if Chloe's apology had removed a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying, the weight of doubt, of second-guessing, of wondering if maybe I had been wrong about everything, but I hadn't been wrong, and now even they knew it. 10 years after that night before Chloe's wedding, I was invited to give a TED Talk. The topic was resilience and recovery from family trauma. I stood on that famous red circle, looking out at thousands of people in the audience and millions more who would eventually watch online, and I told my story without shame or hesitation. I talked about the crystal vase and the champagne toast, about the years of gaslighting and manipulation, about the moment I decided to leave and the aftermath of that choice. But more importantly, I talked about what came after the revenge, after the satisfaction of watching them fall. Revenge, I said toward the end of my talk, is often portrayed as this satisfying, complete thing. You hurt someone who hurt you, and then you feel better. But real life isn't like that. Real revenge, real justice, isn't about watching someone suffer. It's about refusing to suffer anymore yourself. It's about building something so beautiful and so true that their absence becomes a gift rather than a loss. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. It's creating a life so full of love and meaning and peace that the people who hurt you become irrelevant. They become characters in a story you barely remember, shadows that once blocked your light but don't anymore. The talk went viral. Within a week, it had been viewed 10 million times. My book sales tripled. I was invited to speak at universities, at conferences, on podcasts and television shows. The message resonated with far more people than I had ever imagined, but success brought its own complications. With visibility came vulnerability. Internet trolls found my story and decided I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to destroy my family. They sent hate mail, told me I should have worked harder to maintain the relationship, accused me of being vindictive and cruel. At first, the criticism hurt. I found myself doubting again, wondering if maybe I had gone too far, if maybe I should have tried harder to fix things before burning them down completely. But then I would read the messages from other survivors, people who told me my story had saved their lives, had given them permission to leave, had shown them that there was life after abuse. And I realized that the people who criticized me were people who had never been in my position. They were people who had families that, while imperfect, fundamentally loved and respected them. They couldn't conceive of a family so toxic that leaving was the only option for survival, and I couldn't expect them to understand something so far outside their experience. So I stopped reading the hate mail and focused on the messages that mattered, the ones from people who got it, who had lived it, who needed to hear that they weren't alone. 12 years after leaving Maple Creek, I received news that my father had died in prison. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected. He was 72 years old. The notification came from a lawyer, someone handling his estate. There wasn't much left. Most of his assets had been seized or sold to pay legal fees and restitution. But there was a small amount of money and a few personal items, and as his daughter, I was entitled to a share. I declined immediately. I didn't want his money or his belongings. I didn't want anything that tied me to him anymore. But the news of his death stirred up complicated emotions I hadn't anticipated. Relief was there, certainly. He couldn't hurt anyone else now. But there was also a strange sadness. Not for the man he was, but for the father he might have been, if he had been capable of love instead of cruelty. I attended his funeral, though I stayed in the back and left before anyone could approach me. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, to witness the final closing of that chapter. Eleanor was there, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Chloe sat beside her, both of them dressed in black, both of them crying. I felt nothing for them. Not hatred, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just a distant acknowledgement that they existed and that their existence no longer had anything to do with me. As I drove back to the airport, back to Portland and Lisa and the life I had built, I thought about what Richard's death meant. In many ways, he had died to me years ago, the moment I walked out of that house for the last time. His physical death didn't change anything fundamental. But it did mark an ending, a final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. That night, I stood in front of the cracked family portrait hanging in my office. I looked at Richard's face, frozen in a smile that had never been real, and I felt the last thread of connection snap. "Goodbye," I said aloud to the image. Then I took the portrait down, wrapped it carefully, and put it in storage. I didn't need it anymore. The reminder of where I had come from was no longer necessary. I knew who I was and what I had overcome. I didn't need physical evidence anymore. 15 years after leaving Maple Creek, I published my second book, a deeper dive into the psychology of familial abuse and the long-term effects of childhood scapegoating. This book was more academic, more research-focused, but still grounded in the reality of lived experience. The dedication page read simply, "For everyone who was made to feel like they were the problem, when the problem was never you." By this point, I had built a consulting practice, working with therapists and organizations to better understand and support people from toxic family systems. I trained professionals on how to recognize signs of abuse, how to validate their clients' experiences, how to help people navigate the complex grief that comes from choosing to leave a family. My work took me all over the country, and everywhere I went, I met more people with stories like mine. The details were always different, but the emotional truth was the same. They had been scapegoated, diminished, used, and discarded, and they had found the strength to leave. Each person I met reinforced what I had come to believe. Leaving wasn't the tragedy. Staying would have been. One evening, after a particularly intense training session in Chicago, I sat alone in my hotel room and reflected on the journey I had taken. 15 years. It seemed impossible that so much time had passed, that the girl who had been beaten with a crystal vase had become this woman with 2 published books and a career helping others heal. I thought about the question Chloe had asked in her email all those years ago. Was your revenge really worth it? And I finally had a complete answer. It wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge, not really. Exposing them had been about truth, about refusing to be complicit in the lie anymore, about protecting future victims from their manipulation. The real victory wasn't their downfall, it was my rise. It was the life I had built from nothing, the love I had found, the peace I had cultivated, the purpose I had discovered. It was waking up every day in a home where I was valued, in a relationship where I was cherished, doing work that mattered. They had tried to make me believe I was worthless, and I had proven them wrong in the most fundamental way possible. Not by becoming rich or famous or conventionally successful, but by becoming whole. By becoming myself, fully and unapologetically. That was worth everything. 20 years after leaving Maple Creek, I received one final letter. It came to my publisher, forwarded to me with a note that it had arrived anonymously. Inside was a single page, handwritten on ordinary notebook paper. Ava, I'm dying. Cancer, stage 4, maybe a few months left. I don't know if you'll ever read this, and I don't expect you to care, but I wanted you to know that you were right about everything. We were monsters to you, and you deserved better. You always deserved better. I hope you found it. I hope you found people who saw your worth. I hope you're happy. That's all. Just that I hope you're happy. Eleanor. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a box with the other remnants of my past. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, but I did think about Eleanor's words over the following days. She hoped I was happy. After everything, that's what she wished for me. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, just happiness. And I had found it, in abundance, in ways she could never have imagined. I thought about writing back, about telling her yes, I was happy. I had found everything she had denied me in that house. But in the end, I decided my happiness wasn't for her to know. It was mine alone, built by me, protected by me. Shared only with people who had earned the right to witness it. Eleanor died 3 months later. I found out through an obituary online. There was a small service, barely attended. Chloe was listed as her only surviving family member. I felt a whisper of sadness for the waste of it all. 3 people who could have chosen differently, who could have loved instead of destroyed, who could have built something real instead of maintaining a beautiful facade over rotten corruption. But they had made their choices, and I had made mine. Today, 25 years after leaving Maple Creek, I sit in my home office in Portland, looking out at the garden Lisa and I have cultivated over 2 decades of marriage. I am 53 years old, with gray in my hair and laugh lines around my eyes and a life so rich it sometimes takes my breath away. I think about that girl who was beaten the night before her sister's wedding, and I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now. That she was never the problem. That she was stronger than she knew. That there was a whole beautiful life waiting for her on the other side of that door, if she could just find the courage to walk through it. But I can't go back. None of us can. All we can do is move forward, day by day, choice by choice, building the lives we deserve one small decision at a time. My phone buzzes with a text from Lisa. Dinner's ready, love. Come eat. I smile, save my work, and head downstairs. In the kitchen, Lisa has made my favorite meal, and we sit together at the table we built from reclaimed wood, eating and laughing and planning our next adventure. This is my revenge, if you want to call it that. This ordinary, extraordinary life full of love and peace and purpose. This life where I am seen, valued, and cherished. This life where the worst thing that ever happened to me became the catalyst for the best things that ever happened to me. I didn't just survive my family. I transcended them. And in doing so, I became more than they ever imagined I could be. I became free.